So, Kenneth Roth, thank you for joining us. So much to talk about. There's so many atrocities happening in the world today, all across the globe, really. I just want to start with Gaza. You served as executive director of Human Rights Watch for 30 years. I'm sure you've seen the best and the worst of humanity in your work. But with 17,000 children killed, the total death toll much higher, starvation widespread, the denial of aid, people being killed just for queuing for food. How does the humanitarian situation in Gaza compare to what you've seen over the years?
Obviously, what's happening in Gaza today is absolutely horrible. And I think, why it stands out is that you have a completely modern military, one of the best in the world on the part of Israel, supplied largely by the United States, but also by other major Western governments. And it's using this complete superiority to pummel Palestinian civilians of Gaza, ostensibly to fight Hamas, but doing it in a way where civilian population is, a completely predictable victim of all of this. And indeed, the Israeli government, seems to be virtually indifferent to civilian suffering. And often that's the point of its actions. When it is imposing starvation for weeks at a time, really months at a time, that's not aimed at Hamas, that's aimed at ordinary civilians. When it bombs even a military target, accepting that the civilian casualties say to go after, some low-level Hamas fighter, that 20 civilians can be killed, and that is deemed acceptable. That's deemed somehow proportionate. That shows just an utter disregard for civilian life. And so I think that that's what is so disturbing about this, that you have nothing like a fair contest. It's almost unfair to call it a war. I mean, yes, Hamas is there in some residual form fighting back, but mostly this is just Israel pummeling Gaza and doing it in large part, knowing and sometimes intending for civilians to be the target.
You think deliberately Israel is targeting civilians?
Well, certainly with starvation, yes, that's the whole point of it. In terms of, the use of lethal force, it's often difficult to show that they're deliberately targeting civilians, but often they're just utterly indifferent to civilians. Now, with these, hundreds upon hundreds of civilians who are killed lining up for food, it's hard to know what Israel's even doing there. Is there even a pretense that they're Hamas fighters there, or are they just like killing desperate, starving people who show up? When Israel, fires on anybody who enters, some often undeclared no-go zone, again, they know that civilians are the result, that civilian casualties are the result. When Israel, drops these huge 2,000-pound bombs on Palestinian neighborhoods, it knows that many civilians are going to be killed. When it fires even on military targets, accepting a hugely disproportionate civilian toll, again, it just is accepting this civilian death rate. So, the line between intending versus utter indifference, it's often hard to draw that line, but in some ways it doesn't matter. What Israel is doing is, clearly systematic war crimes, and I think quite fairly characterized as genocide.
Is there any justification for killing children under the excuse of targeting one terrorist?
International law, even if you are targeting a legitimate military target, so let's say, a Hamas fighter, still requires that the attacker refrain from shooting if the predictable harm to civilians will be disproportionate. And so, let's take, the beach cafe that was recently hit with a 500-pound bomb, a very large bomb. I don't know what Israel was targeting there, presumably some Hamas fighter. We never really know. But, to choose such a large bomb in a cafe that was known to be filled with civilians is, it's almost impossible to imagine why that was deemed to be a proportionate civilian toll. And again, it just underscores this seeming utter indifference to Palestinian civilian lives on the part of Israeli authorities. And you can say the same thing about, targeting the hospitals, where, Israel always says, oh, there was, a Hamas command center there. They never prove this. It often, when there is some examination of what's there, it's, a single tunnel with a handful of rifles. I mean, nothing that would justify depriving Palestinian civilians of, urgently needed medical care in the middle of a war, when obviously the need is quite acute. So, I mean, you can, go through case after case after case. Israel always, they're sophisticated. They always will claim that they're targeting Hamas. Or they'll say, oh, Hamas is using human shields, or Hamas is endangering civilians. But I mean, at this stage, those excuses just wear thin because Israel's in complete control of the situation. It keeps, moving civilians from here to there in utterly inhumane conditions. And, this latest killings at aid distribution points, to put that in context, I mean, first Israel starves Gaza, deprives it of basic food and necessities for months at a time. Then it, instead of entrusting the UN with its established distribution network to deliver aid, it sets up its own handful of sites, knowing that these are going to be insufficient, knowing that they're going to be overcrowded by desperately starving civilians. And when it seems a bit too chaotic and the Israeli soldiers, they get a bit too nervous, they start, shooting to kill using lethal munitions, the people who are showing up over and over and over again. So, we have to stop pretending that this is a mistake. This is clearly a very deliberate policy. When you keep doing the same thing day after day, knowing that the result will be hundreds of Palestinian civilians killed, at some point you got to say, this is deliberate. This is what they want to be doing. And I think that's what we have right now.
Mm. How are they getting away with it? We've got international law. We've built all these institutions after World War II. We pledged never again, lest we forget. We created the United Nations. How is this still happening?
Well, I mean, I think, first of all, but many people say, oh, is this the demise of international law? I think, no, that's an exaggeration. We have to distinguish between, a blatant violation of the law and the demise of the law. And I actually think there's good reason here to think that we're dealing with a blatant violation, but not a problem of law, in the sense that if you look at the international institutions, they basically are all responding quite vigorously. The UN General Assembly has repeatedly denounced what Israel is doing. The UN Human Rights Council has done the same thing and is issuing, numerous reports and conducting investigations. The International Court of Justice is hearing South Africa's genocide case. The International Criminal Court has, charged Prime Minister Netanyahu and former Defense Minister Gallant with the war crime of starvation and deprivation of the civilian population. So there has been a vigorous response. I mean, is there more that could be done? I mean, yes, I'd like to see the International Criminal Court charging senior officials for the bombing. That hasn't happened yet. But I think we have to recognize, what's going on here, which is that the Netanyahu government is able to just ignore all of this because it has a critical constituency of one, which is the US president. Even under Biden, he would say the right things. He would periodically say, oh, please, stop starving civilians, please stop bombing civilians. But he would continue to deliver US military aid and US arms, with the exception of his suspension of those awful 2,000-pound bombs that were devastating neighborhoods. Trump comes into office and renews delivery of the 2,000-pound bombs. There's nothing to use this enormous leverage that he has with the massive US aid and arms sales, and basically gives Netanyahu the green light. Now, in those circumstances, the Israeli government figures we're just going to keep plugging ahead. We can do this without the world. Now, there is some reason to think that even Trump is souring on this. We see him differing with Netanyahu on a variety of things, whether it's lifting the sanctions on the new Syrian authorities, or cutting a deal with the Houthis that doesn't involve any promise on their part to stop attacking Israel, negotiating with Hamas, negotiating for a while with Iran, pressing Netanyahu a couple of times for ceasefires, and currently, again, trying to push through a ceasefire. So, there is some tension there between Trump and Netanyahu, but, Trump hasn't really used the leverage that he has. And in those circumstances, that's the problem. All the international institutions are doing what they can, but, there is no international police force. There's no international military. International law is dependent on nation states to enforce it. And here, the state with the greatest ability to influence Israeli conduct, the US government, is still giving Netanyahu the green light. So that's the problem. We have a Trump problem. We have a US president problem that, given the power of the US, given Israel's extraordinary dependence on the United States, Israel is able to thumb its nose at international law and international institutions. But we shouldn't say that this is, the demise of international law. This is the utter amorality of the Trump administration, which I hope changes, but for the time being hasn't.
If I can just push back on that, what is the point of international law if there's no enforcement of it? If basically what we're seeing is might is right. If you're powerful enough to defy international law, then you can, and then you can help your ally who wants to do the same. So what is the point then of international law today?
Well, I mean, you could say the same thing. What's the point of international human rights standards? There is really no formal enforcement mechanism. But, as I describe it in my recent book, Righting Wrongs, the ability to spotlight the discrepancy between a government's claim to respect human rights law and the often ugly reality is embarrassing, it's shameful, it's delegitimizing, and governments go to great lengths to avoid having that discrepancy spotlighted. It is a significant source of pressure. In the case of Israel, we're finding that the stigmatization of the Israeli government because of its genocide in Gaza has become extreme. We're seeing, even within the United States, already, I think, a majority of Democratic voters are opposed to what Israel is doing, and growing numbers of Republicans too. Israel has a real long-term problem in the United States. So the fact that we can't shut off the genocide today doesn't mean that nothing is happening. There clearly is a huge loss of Israel's esteem around the world, and most significantly in the United States, because that's what matters for its ongoing military support from Washington. And so, I think we have to look at this as a work in progress, a work that is even affecting Trump. He can't afford to be utterly indifferent to public opinion. And as public opinion says, why is the American government aiding and abetting genocide? That's a tough question to answer when you're Trump. And so I do think that, Israel's in trouble, and that, even Trump, who for the moment is backing Israel, this is not a guy who has a long-term commitment to anything other than himself. And if he feels that his personal political interests are not advanced by his continued support for Israel's genocidal conduct in Gaza, he could turn on a dime and things could be very different tomorrow. So I think we have to look at this as a process. It hasn't been adequate so far. The Palestinian people have suffered enormously. But I do think that the pressure is growing on Netanyahu and on Trump to begin doing something differently.
How do you think this will end? You've seen so many other conflicts. You've been involved in humanitarian aid for 3 decades. Based on that, how do these kinds of conflicts, genocides, how do they normally end? How do you think this will end?
First of all, I mean, there's the short-term end and the long-term end. Will there be a lasting ceasefire right now? That's the first question. The long-term question is, will there be a Palestinian state? Now, short-term, Trump does seem to be pushing for a ceasefire. The far-right Israeli government's position is that, okay, we'll stop, but we're going to push everybody into some tiny little concentration camp in some utterly ruined section of Gaza and hold them there in decrepit conditions, hopefully until they realize that there's no life for them in Gaza and they flee. What the far right wants in Israel is another Nakba, another massive ethnic cleansing. So it doesn't have to worry about Hamas because there won't be anybody left in Gaza. I mean, that's their dream. Trump articulated that when he came into office. That was his idea of a Gaza Riviera, a massive war crime, a crime against humanity. Fortunately, the Egyptian and the Jordanian governments, the potential would-be recipients of these forced refugees, have said no, they want nothing to do with it. Despite their dependence on U.S. military aid, they said a flat no. So Trump isn't pushing this anymore, but is he going to stand up to the far right and prevent it? Unclear. What I hope happens is, the fighting stops and people in Gaza begin to be able to rebuild their lives. That's not going to happen without very significant financial assistance, probably from the Arab Gulf states. And are they going to plow massive money into Gaza if it's just going to be destroyed again in another 5 years? Probably not. And you hear even the Saudi crown prince saying, look, I'd like to normalize relations with Israel. I'd like to help out here, but I need to see concrete steps for a Palestinian state. Now, Netanyahu's view has been, forever, over my dead body. He's devoted his political career to avoiding that. Again, the wild card in this is Trump. Trump, it's almost laughable, wants a Nobel Peace Prize. Netanyahu, who's no dummy, goes to the White House and says, I nominated you for a Nobel Peace Prize, even though Netanyahu himself is the biggest obstacle to Trump getting that, because you don't get a Nobel Peace Prize for, aiding and abetting genocide and finally getting it to stop. If he wants a Nobel Peace Prize, he's got to create a Palestinian state. And Trump knows that. And again, will his personal ambition, will his massive, if fragile ego push him to do something that no other president has done? The reason that's not unthinkable is that other presidents have always had to worry about being attacked from the right, particularly the Christian evangelicals, who in the United States are the biggest supporters of Israel. Trump doesn't have to worry about attacks from the right. He owns the right. And so he actually has more political leeway. This is not a guy who has any love lost for the Palestinians, but he loves himself. And would that self-regard lead him to do the right thing for the wrong reason? Maybe. I think that sadly is our best hope at this stage.
Do you think he needs to sanction Israel?
But at this point, the sanctions are less important than just stopping the arms sales and the military aid. I mean, would I like to see him impose, sanctions on Netanyahu for committing genocide? Of course. That's far better than, sanctioning Francesca Albanese for describing the genocide, or sanctioning, Karim Khan, the International Criminal Court prosecutor, for charging Netanyahu for his war crime starvation strategy. I mean, those are utterly amoral steps that the U.S. has taken. But before we even talk about, sanctioning Netanyahu, let's stop the U.S. complicity in these war crimes. Let's stop the aiding and abetting of genocide. Stop the arms sales. Stop the military aid. That would make an immediate radical difference in Israeli government conduct.
The Israeli narrative is that we're doing this for the defense of the Jewish people, the Jewish home. And yourself, you're the son of a Jewish refugee who fled Nazi Germany in the 1930s. How do you feel personally that today Israel, in the name of the Jewish people, is carrying out what many, and yourself also calling is a genocide against Palestinians? How does that make you feel?
I mean, awful, in a word. As you know, my father fled Nazi Germany as a 12-year-old boy in July 1938 from New York. So, I grew up with stories about what it was like to be, a young Jewish boy living under the Nazis. I was very aware of the evil that they did. It's part of what pushed me to devote my career to defending human rights. I do think, there are a number of super problematic aspects here. I mean, one, the fact that, Israel was created as a haven for the Jews after the Holocaust, after one genocide, clearly in no way justifies the second genocide. That is an utterly outrageous use of history. And still Israel hides behind this halo of, how can we do any wrong? We are here as a refuge from the Holocaust. But in fact, they're doing horrible things wrong. And we can no longer allow what happened to the Jews, in the late 30s and early 40s to justify today's awful atrocities against Palestinians. The other thing that, ironically, many supporters of the Israeli government and the government itself does is that it charges people who criticize the Israeli government with being anti-Semitic. And, this is such a blatant misuse of the concept. I think we have to recognize that today Jews around the world are threatened by anti-Semitism. But when the Israeli government starts using charges of anti-Semitism just to defend its own atrocities in Gaza, that cheapens the concept of anti-Semitism at a point where it's really needed. It basically says, defending us, the Israeli government, is more important than defending you, Jews around the world. It, throws Jews around the world under the bus in the name of protecting Netanyahu. So, we have to look at the cynicism here. I mean, this is not representing the Jewish people. This is harming the Jewish people in the name of, keeping Netanyahu in power and, letting him avoid the corruption charges that are pending against him. I mean, it is so awfully cynical. And the fact that he is, willing to sacrifice, not only tens of thousands of Palestinian lives in pursuit of his own very narrow self-interest, but is actually jeopardizing Jews around the world by this misuse of charges of anti-Semitism. This shows just the utter sick cynicism of the man, Netanyahu.
There are many other atrocities happening across the globe, many catastrophes, many human rights violations. Yemen has been undergoing, a man-made famine. Are we forgetting all the other things that, are going wrong in the world today?
If you look in Sudan, you have this paramilitary group, the Rapid Support Forces, that, they used to be called the Janjaweed. They committed genocide already, 2 decades ago. The United Arab Emirates is arming them as they slaughter, Sudanese in Darfur. So, that is a horrible situation that gets way too little attention. Rwanda has invaded Eastern Congo and is again, committing mass atrocities there, much as it did a decade ago. Uh, there's not much difference between what Paul Kagame is doing in Eastern Congo and what Vladimir Putin is doing in Eastern Ukraine. But Ukraine gets a lot of attention, and Rwanda gets pretty much a pass, despite its blatant invasion of Eastern Congo, essentially to mine its minerals and to profit from the economic opportunities there. So, here again, it's a devastating African conflict, which the world just ignores. It's almost as if the world doesn't notice sub-Saharan Africa until you add 3 or so zeros to the death toll, and then they begin, if that, it's sort of 1,000 times worse than something happening in the West, then maybe they notice. It's something like that, and it's pretty awful. Myanmar, where this brutal junta continues to crush the people's desire for democracy, that gets very little attention. Yemen, as you mentioned, which is suffering at this stage, mainly under the Houthi, is also a humanitarian disaster that is largely neglected unless the Houthi happen to attack Western ships going nearby. So I do think that the world has a very selective attention span. The attention on Gaza is appropriate. I just wish there was more willingness to learn about and address these other severe atrocities elsewhere in the world.
Do you feel that these atrocities have become normalized? They're so widespread today. It's almost as if like it's just the day-to-day norm. People growing up today, the children, they're going to be growing up in a world of conflict. Have we become desensitized to these kinds of crimes?
I mean, that's always the fear, but I wouldn't pretend that this is the worst moment ever. I mean, I began doing human rights work when there were a bunch of proxy wars under the Cold War, where the US and the Soviet Union weren't fighting directly, but they were fighting indirectly through a bunch of, very brutal civil wars where, again, there was large-scale loss of life. Or you look in the 90s when there was kind of these massive ethnic conflicts in the former Yugoslavia. There was the Rwandan genocide. There've been, plenty of awful occasions in the past. So I wouldn't overstate this. I wouldn't pretend that, today is so bad that people will become insensitive. I think there is sensitivity there. The difficulty of now is that, we have a White House with a man who has, little interest in the rest of the world. Western Europe, which last Trump term did step in and fill some of that void. Today is preoccupied by, dealing with Trump's virtual abandonment of NATO and his imposition of tariffs. So there is a lot of turmoil coming from the White House, which is sapping the energy available to address many of these awful conflicts around the world. So this is a problem. But again, I don't think we should overstate it. I don't think we should say, we're insensitive, or this is the demise of international law or the demise of the international system. This is a challenging time. We've got to fight to maintain the values underlying the international humanitarian order. And we got to push to do what we can to stop this enormous suffering that is being caused in different parts of the world.
Finally, if I just may ask you, 30 years of humanitarian work, what would be your lesson or message that you would pass on to future generations?
Well, I described this in my book, Righting Wrongs, which was just published in February. And one of the lessons I really try to draw on that is that even in the most dire situations, even with the most difficult adversaries, the Chinese government, the Israeli government, the Saudi government, I run through a bunch of different examples. There's always something you can do to put pressure on an abusive government to change the cost-benefit analysis behind its repression. And I illustrate a bunch of tools that Human Rights Watch used under my leadership. But these are, illustrations of a broader approach. And so even today, I think we have to recognize that, whoever the adversary is, even if it's Trump, even if it's Xi Jinping in China, there's always something that we can do that will cause them pain if they continue down an abusive path. And we need to figure that out and collectively exert that pain to try to change what is currently a pretty ugly avenue that they're pursuing.